Good afternoon. It is Saturday, October the 22nd, and we are entering into the spookiest season of the year, which is why I've decided to talk about a decidedly non-spooky subject. After all, I scare easily. You see, at the end of the novel Agents of Artifice, Jace was faced with an opportunity. He had in his mental grip, the chance to take all of the knowledge that Tezzeret had accumulated, all of his knowledge of his individual cells, his agents, all the technology he was working on, all of his plans and all of his schemes, and he had the opportunity to take that for himself and use that knowledge to run the Infinite Consortium, something that an earlier Jace, a more power-driven Jace, might have done. But at the end of the novel, he decided that lust for power, lust for more in his life was just not worth it. It had only ever brought him grief and misery, after all, up until that point. And so he chose to let go, let that knowledge die with Tezzeret's mind, as he chose to mind-crush Tezzeret, basically. And he moved on with his life, leading to the Jace we knew from The Secretist and Magic's Gatewatch saga. But what if he hadn't? What if in that moment Jace decided that that power, that authority was what he did want? What if he decided to go ahead with Liliana's plans to either have him rule the Infinite Consortium or have them rule it together under Bolas's guidance, I suppose. Ruling it for Bolas, I suppose, is the real endgame for Liliana there. It's an interesting question to think about because it takes Jace down a road he hasn't really had the chance to do so. That is, a road of real power and authority over others. And by that I mean, he does eventually become the Guild Pact in the modern story, but he doesn't really ever exercise that power over others, whereas I believe Jace, as the leader of the Infinite Consortium, would be a very different individual, and I wanted to talk about that today. I've been wanting to talk about it for a while, ever since I finished reading the novel, but here we are. Let's begin with my first idea of how it would go, and my first thought, my first theory on how Jace would behave in this scenario is that he would become bitter, paranoid. As the ruler of the Infinite Consortium, up until this point, Jace has had a really hard last few months leading up to this decision. Not all of them, but most of his friends are dead because he was betrayed in his own way by Liliana Vess. Callist is dead. Tezzeret, whom he had put a lot of trust into, turned out to be a rat bastard, and Liliana turned out to not be the lover he thought she was, or he hoped she was. So I believed that if Jace were to take control of the Infinite Consortium, it would not be with Liliana at his side. It would more or less be under his own power, underneath Bolas, and he would do it fairly bitterly. He wouldn't trust his lieutenants. He would constantly be using his mental abilities to check their thoughts, figure out what's going on, and he would basically never give any of them the closeness that he had with the Gatewatch. None of them would ever be companions or friends to him. They would always just be employees that he kept at arm's length at all times, and I'm willing to bet that he would probably not interact with too many of his lieutenants directly. He would either send people to give orders, or he would use the guise of illusions to pretend to be somebody else giving orders for the leader of the Infinite Consortium. Inversely, I think he would be immensely loyal to Nico Bolas. Now, keep in mind, this Nico Bolas, the one featured in Agents of Artifice and the Alara block, is not the same dragon we experienced during War of the Spark. He is altogether a very different character who behaves very differently. And by that I mean this Nico Bolas is much more, polite. He's more of a polite villain who has grand plans, but ultimately he's not a bastard about it. And more to the point, he's manipulative, but he's also very caring, I should say. Not caring, but protective of his subordinates. and he's not exactly a savage bastard that we later see. I think Jace would be fairly loyal to Bolas, not just because of the fear of a giant dragon being able to kill him at any time, but because Bolas is, in turn, protective of and fairly believing in Jace. Unlike Tezzeret, who was constantly talking down to Jace and constantly belittling him, Bolas would be complimentive of Jace. He would believe in his abilities. After all, Jace would be, to Bolas, something he truly needs and something he would be very happy to have on his side. Not just the leader of the Infinite Consortium, but somebody who could use some very potent and useful mind magic. And Nico Bolas is not the kind of individual to squander his resources. He's the kind of individual to take absolute care of his pawns at this time. Again, this is early Bolas, not later Bolas, who was a complete idiot. But yeah, that's my thoughts on how Jace would be, but I'm not the only person who has thoughts on this. I reached out to some friends to talk to some of them. The one who I think gave me the biggest differing opinion was Gam, a friend of mine. She writes fan fiction, and so I reached out to her, and she gave me quite the opinion as well, and I quite liked it. You see, Gam had a different opinion on Jace, whereas I believed that Jace would be a bitter, paranoid, constantly mind-reading individual. Gam was of the opinion that he would be not necessarily bittered, but empowered, and by that I mean he would be in a position that he kind of wanted the entire time throughout the novel. Remember, Tezzeret and Bellatrix were constantly talking down to him, whereas under Bolas, he would receive gratification for his work. More to the point, Jace in a position of power, in a position of believing he's doing the right thing, and he would. Jace would try to lead the Infinite Consortium in a positive way. He wouldn't try to be another Tezzeret, but in doing so, faced with all of the trauma and trials he'd faced up to this point, he would do it in a different way. He would be a monster, but not for the same reasons Tezzeret would. Tezzeret was a monster who berated and tortured his underlings regularly. He would take this mana blade that absolutely was anguishing to any person who had a connection to magic, and he would torture his subordinates for any kind of failure. It was a frequent thing, and it made Tezzeret into a bastard. Jace wouldn't do that. Jace would instead be the kind of individual who used mind control on you and made you go along with his plans, because to him, that's just the best thing for you. He's doing this for your own good. He's doing this because it's the right thing to do. He wouldn't be torturing you. He would be having you go along with his plans. And we do see Jace do this a few times throughout the story, where he'll use mind magic on people, controlling them for their own good. But here, Gam is of the opinion that Jace would ramp that up to 11. He would still be moral in his own opinion of it, but he would be much more like Urza, in that his plans and the way he interacts with people would be he would be a rat bastard, but for very different reasons than Tezzeret. He would be a monster who uses his powers to make you go along with whatever it is he has planned for you, because in his own opinion, it's for your own good. Now, regardless of which version of Jace you prescribe to, the angry, bitter Jace or the empowered, it's for your own good Jace, the fact remains that the story is changed by Jace's decision to take control of the Infinite Consortium, and he is not necessarily a good person. Now, the first major change is the Secretist, the set of digital novels that follow Jace on his journey to becoming the Living Guild Pact by solving the implicit maze. I don't think Jace would necessarily be involved with this event. I personally believe he would be off-world dealing with Consortium business. And that's why I personally believe that the Guild Pact, the new Guild Pact, the Living Guild Pact of Ravnica, would be Imara Tantris. She's the most, of the people who did participate in the implicit maze beyond Jace, she's perhaps the most neutral of individuals and the person who most strongly desired for genuine peace between the guilds. So I do believe the elf would become the Living Guild Pact, and she does have a connection to Jace, so it'd be kind of interesting to see how the Master of the Infinite Consortium and the new head of Ravnica interact. Would she try to push his organization off-world? Possibly, who knows. Another major change is the formation of the Gatewatch. You see, Jace was the first person Gideon Jor went to for help in regards to the Eldrazi problem on Zendikar. I do still think the Gatewatch would be formed. I do still think that somehow, someway, the Eldrazi problem would be dealt with. I just don't think Jace would be a part of it, or at least not directly involved. After that, it's hard to guess how the story would change, because by this point, Nico Bolas had become a very different kind of person based on the changes the writers made to him going forward, so who knows how the plot could evolve and how Jace's role in it could shift. But he would not be part of the Gatewatch. He would not be the Living Guild Pact. He would not be as directly involved in the plot as a lot of the other characters, most likely. But this was just a quick thought exercise. What do you guys think? How do you think the story could change if Jace was in charge of one of the most prominent interplanar organizations in the setting? I personally think it would be a rather bad thing for the story overall. Not the story necessarily, but for the characters in it, because Jace is quite the potent person to have as an enemy, and his organization has a lot of enemies. I think it's interesting to think about. Thank you guys for sticking with me for this quick, rambling thought process video. I hope you guys have a great day.